Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to ParaMOOC 2023. Come on, there we go. Also known as Parapsychology Research and Education. The topic this year is apparitions, hauntings, and poltergeists. We started the live sessions on February 28th, and they finish up on April 1st. I'd like to say thank you to my organizational team, Brian Williams from the Psychical Research Foundation, and Natasha Chisdis from Chisfilm, both from Albuquerque. I'd also like to say a very big thank you to Lisa Coley and Anastasia Demalis, the president and executive directors of the Parapsychology Foundation. The PF has been an unstinting support of the ParaMOOC series since my late husband, Carlos S. Alvarado, and I founded it in 2015. So we're really grateful to them. Plus, they're a wonderful family. So this morning, we've got Anne Winsper from Para.Science in Cheshire in the UK. The title of the talk is Creating the Dead, How Do Auditory Perception, Paranormal Belief, and Individual Differences Affect the Interpretation of Alleged Electronic Voice Phenomena. And today's March 28th. Anne Winsper is a psychical phenomenologist. I practiced that this morning, Anne. A psychical phenomenologist, and also works full-time as a medication systems manager in a UK NHS hospital. Her main paranormal interests are hauntings, electronic voice phenomena, and time slips, but she has investigated a wide range of paranormal phenomena. Anne has been interested in paranormal events, particularly hauntings and spontaneous phenomena, for over 50 years. She is a founding member of Para.Science, created 30 years ago to conduct serious study, research, and investigation. In 2020, Anne obtained a Ph.D. in psychology at the University of Central Lancashire with a thesis on our topic today, interpreting electronic voice phenomena, the role of auditory perception, paranormal belief, and individual differences. Anne is a member of the Parapsychological Association, the Society for Psychical Research, and the Ghost Club, and has given many talks on various paranormal subjects. She's also a regular contributor to both radio and television programs and has had articles published in magazines and chapters in books. So let me stop sharing. And
is that visible?
Yep, it's looking good.
Fantastic. Let's get started. So, what is electronic voice phenomenon? Why do I think it's important that we study it? Well, the first thing I do want to say is I'm not a skeptic. I'm very much on the fence about a lot of things, and EVP is one of those things. I've heard some extremely interesting things appear on recordings. I think we need to understand how we misperceive things before we can claim a paranormal origin. Hence, most of this talk is about how we misperceive things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I don't think there's a phenomenon to look at. So, electronic voice phenomena describes a technique of apparently communicating with the spirit world, talking to people beyond the grave by the presence of anomalous voices appearing initially on magnetic tape recordings, but now on any electronic device. The idea of communicating with spirits using radio technology was proposed, although probably not entirely seriously, by such eminent people as Edison and Marconi. Possibly the first documented case of capturing these anomalous voices was by an ethnologist, Waldemar Bogaras, who recorded apparent spirit voices on a phonograph in 1901 whilst observing a shamanic spirit conjuring ritual. And I was going to play you a clip of it, but it seems to have completely disappeared off the internet. So I've got the book, but I'm afraid I can't play you the sound clip anymore. So the first person to try and actually capture these voices was by a photographer, von Zale, who regularly heard apparently disembodied voices and tried initially to record these on primitive disc recording devices in the 1930s. Sadly, he didn't document any of these early experiments, but he did describe to William Welch how he managed to capture anomalous voices in 1945 on a wire recording device. The voices were very faint, so he abandoned further experimentation until 1956, when he switched to tape recordings. In the 1950s, a number of researchers described successfully capturing these unusual voices on tape, including Raymond Bayliss, who collaborated with von Zale. Friedrich Jürgensen had also discovered the presence of apparently anomalous voices on tape recordings he'd made of birdsong. It was a Latvian psychologist, however, Konstantin Raudive, who brought the field to public prominence by carrying out a large number of experiments, which he released in a seminal book in 1971. There have been a number of different methods used for recording these voices over the years. Raudive himself developed at least 5 different methods of obtaining voices on tape. The method commonly used for obtaining these voices is to detune a radio so that only white noise can be heard, and then place a recording microphone next to the radio. You can then, while recording the white noise, ask questions of the spirit world, and when you play the recordings back, anomalous voices have appeared on the tape, apparently answering your questions or giving you information. There are a number of variations on the methodology, but one of the common factors seems to be the requirement for some form of carrier sound for the voices to be able to manifest over, although some researchers do say this may not be required. Natural sounds have also been described as being useful as carrier waves. For example, waves crashing on the beach, rotating ceiling fans and running water. Again, I did have a link to a website that demonstrated this, but having looked at it recently, the author has forsaken all EVP research as being against the word of God and taken all the clips down, so I can't play you these natural clips. One of the goals of researchers over the years has been to build a device that allows real-time communication with the spirit world, rather than having to play back a tape to listen to the voices. As the field has grown, it has expanded to include almost any form of electronic communication, for example, via television, telephone, and computers. And it's now more generally called instrumental transcommunication, a term coined by Senkowski. But I'm only concentrating on the tape or digital recording method, so I'll carry on describing it as electronic voice phenomena, or EVP. In recent years, researchers such as Cardoso have attempted to replicate the recordings of anomalous voices on tapes under controlled laboratory conditions, with reportedly successful results. Cardoso simultaneously uses shortwave radios tuned to either the same radio frequency, which he describes as the Jürgensen wave band, which is approximately 1,500 kilohertz, or to different frequencies. A number of other current researchers have produced what they describe as significant results. However, due to the controversial nature of the subject, mainstream institutions have yet to research the phenomenon, leaving the evidence remaining controversial. Another issue that prevents the subject being taken more seriously by the mainstream is that a number of these researchers profess a strong belief in the afterlife and describe the voices they obtain as providing veridical proof of that afterlife, which unfortunately doesn't go down well with mainstream science. In contrast to these attempts to apply control conditions to investigate the phenomenon, a new method has also sprung up amongst ghost hunters, again in an attempt to conduct real-time communication, and devices such as the ghost box has been developed. The other name for this is radio sweep EVP, which describes how the technique works. Commercially available radios are hacked so that they constantly sweep between the stations, and apparently the spirits utilise fragments of voices, music and noise picked up as the radio sweeps between the stations and assembles these into words, phrases or sentences to communicate with the living. Ghost hunters use these devices to communicate in real time. They can ask questions and get answers straight away. For example.
Are you here? Is anyone here?
That clip was actually interpreted as the investigator asking if there was anyone there and can you hear us? And the reply was apparently, I hear you. So also available are a number of software applications such as EVP Maker, which enables a user to input an audio clip of normal speech, and the program segments the audio clip into short segments and plays them back in a random order. The effect is to replicate the sound of a radio sweep device, with short segments of speech sounds being played in a random order that can be used as a background noise to record EVP over. Although the author of this software claims to disagree with the radio sweep technique, as it is very difficult to distinguish between segments of speech from a radio broadcast and paranormal messages, the sound files created within EVP Maker do resemble these radio sweep files. The technical difference between the two is due to the differing explanations as to how they work. EVP Maker files are meant to be used as a background noise, similar in effect to white noise, that EVP will manifest over, whereas in radio sweep, the spirits manipulate the sound segments themselves to create messages. Of course, the more noise you introduce into the system, the more likely someone is to hear apparent voices within it. The app has now been developed further so that it utilises an audio file containing 72 speech allophones, which the spirits apparently manipulate to create recognisable speech. And of course, nowadays you can get a multitude of EVP apps for your smartphone, some of which utilise internet radio, and some, like the iOvilus, apparently use changes to sensors in your iPhone to produce speech. In fact, the level of scientific quackery that is out there nowadays continually astounds me. But if you want a good laugh, have a look on YouTube for iOvilus clips and watch grown men make spirit pronouncements from a random word generator. And here's an example.
Oh my God. Hello, who are you to call me?
Yeah. Oops. You don't need to hear it twice, I'm sure. So this next clip, I'll play it to you first, but this is made with EVP Maker. Now, according to the person who recorded that one, apparently it says "voi plelav," which it didn't sound anything like that to me, but apparently that's what it says. And if you reverse that, it says "thou help you." I think they're pushing it slightly with that interpretation, but there you go. So what are the actual characteristics of EVP? Well, Raudiver described how it's easy to distinguish spirit voices from ordinary human voices, as they speak with an unusual rhythm and usually switch between languages within a sentence. However, the actual words cannot be distinguished easily, and Raudiver suggests it can take at least 3 months to train the ear to distinguish the words present. The voices can speak quite rapidly, but appear not to follow usual grammatical rules, and occasionally can even be reversed, so they make sense when the tape's played backwards. Some researchers describe the voices as being from familiar people, but in unfamiliar voices. So, for example, one described receiving messages from deceased friends and relatives, but their voices sounded unlike they did in life. However, the other researchers describe recording the voices of their relatives speaking in the same voice they had in life, and Jurgensen even describes obtaining the voices of such people as Churchill and Hitler. Analysis of these EVP voices has shown that there are a number of characteristics common to them, including a number of amendments to the usual human speech sounds, such as an increase in intensity of the signal on the second speech formant, and excessive frequency values for the fundamental frequency and for upper formants. Also described a partial or complete omission of consonants. This just poses the question as to why these apparent characteristics are displayed. Is it due to the difficulties the spirit world have when attempting to communicate? Or is it a more prosaic explanation that doesn't invoke the paranormal at all? Pardon me. So, EVP listening techniques. When playing back EVP voices for confirmation of what they were saying, Raudiver always gave listeners a script of what the voices were saying. He then played the clip repeatedly to the listeners until they either agreed with his interpretation, in which the clip was classed as validated, or until they disagreed with his interpretation, in which case he classed them as a poor listener and discarded their results. Obviously, this is very flawed methodology, and Raudiver himself was observed to make a number of substantial errors during listening, and rather than increasing accuracy, the act of repeated listening was causing him to interpret the sounds into the words he was expecting, rather than words resembling the sounds that were on tape. More recent researchers have also stressed the importance of training, citing the previous unusual characteristics of the voices as a reason why listening training is required. The argument has been made that training and effort would not be required if the voices were ordinary human voices. However, this same phenomenon was described during World War II by trained listeners working at the BBC listening post when trying to distinguish German broadcasts accurately. So difficulty in interpretation is not something that would define something as EVP from a non-human source. There are also descriptions in the serious EVP literature around how to manipulate the clips to improve the clarity of the voices, including accentuating higher frequencies due to EVP being apparently deficient in consonants, applying noise reduction, normalizing the samples and slowing them down. Of course, it can be argued that this manipulation may be creating speech sounds rather than creating clarity of existing sounds. There does appear to be a difference in the approach to EVP research when attempting to record voices, ranging from serious attempts at research utilising higher-end equipment and expert input to the ubiquitous ghost hunter running around apparently haunted buildings while streaming live on social media. So what are we to make of the EVP voices on tape? Obviously, mainstream science has dismissed it, pardon me, as misperception and misinterpretation. Although there haven't been any studies to back this up. Well, there've been a few over recent years, but previously there's been nothing. The opposite view, that these actually are the voices of the dead, presupposes that some form of consciousness survives death, which both retains the characteristics of the person who's deceased and is also capable of communication. Interestingly, the Association Transcommunication, which is undertaking research to support this view, also discounts the ghost hunting method of radio sweep devices for obtaining EVPs. Of course, it is also possible to believe in voices on tape with a non-paranormal explanation. There are very few studies looking at paranormal believers' propensity for auditory misperception. So in my research so far, I've been looking at how and why people may perceive random and pseudo-random noises as voices. One of the main triggers for me to start this research was the fact that skeptics always dismiss this phenomenon as a load of rubbish. And when asked why they hadn't looked at it in detail, they always said, "We don't need to look at it, we know it's rubbish," which for me pretty much sums up a completely unscientific method of approaching any subject, which gave me a useful sideline in the study, which is looking at how skeptics can ignore evidence that is actually there. So psychological and neuropsychological accounts of EVP. It's difficult or impossible to prove or disprove the existence of an afterlife and communication with the dead. However, there has been considerable research into how individuals may misinterpret events as anomalous, particularly how those who believe in the paranormal might be more likely to misinterpret events. For example, Irwin describes a top-down cognitive process whereby people maintain their paranormal belief by utilising deficient reality testing processes, in which they attribute a paranormal explanation to an unusual event without testing whether such an explanation is logically plausible or not. Thus, each apparently paranormal experience reinforces their a priori belief, which in turn reinforces their paranormal interpretation of subsequent events. According to this model, believers will be more likely to report hearing EVPs, particularly if they report having already heard them previously, for example, during ghost hunts. Comparable top-down processes have been shown to occur in human auditory perception. An example, Hines demonstrated how participants rated ambiguous speech as much clearer when they were given a transcript to follow while listening. This mimics the techniques used by EVP researchers such as Rowdiver, and indeed the many YouTube clips where listeners are prompted as to what they should be hearing. In fact, I took part in a supposedly serious study in London where a group of us were attempting to obtain EVPs, and unfortunately the lead investigator sent us all copies of apparent EVPs he'd found in the recordings, where the file names of each clip were the words apparently in the clips. So I couldn't even listen to them. There was no point because I'd been prompted. Blackmore and Moore showed that paranormal believers were more willing to report seeing forms in a noisy visual image, and they suggest this may apply to auditory tasks as well as visual ones. Brugger, Landis and Regard found believers were more likely to report the presence of meaningful information in randomly presented dot patterns, and believers are more prone to make these type 1 errors, a tendency that Shermer calls patternicity, the tendency to find meaningful patterns in meaningless noise. And he suggests that we display this behaviour as it can have survival advantages. Davis et al. Describe how listeners who've been trained in interpreting time-compressed speech show a form of perceptual learning that allows them to still perform better in these listening tasks on retesting a year later, mimicking the model described in EVP, where people can become trained listeners. When people are played sine wave speech but not told it's based on speech, most listeners will not recognise this. But as soon as they're told the sounds and manipulations of natural speech, they will immediately interpret the sounds as words and provide quite accurate transcriptions of the speech. And this shows just how strong the ability to interpret sounds in a linguistic framework can be. And I will give a demo of this. If EVP proves to be nothing more than misperception, it may be supposed that there must be a psychological reason for the individual to be interpreting and believing that they're hearing the voices of the dead. There's been a considerable body of work looking at the reasons why people may assign a paranormal explanation to events. So if we're looking at EVP, in itself a form of paranormal belief, we should be measuring people's paranormal belief in relation to their EVP experiences. Individual differences. So a number of individual difference measures have been used to investigate paranormal belief, and I've used these measures to look at an EVP population. I have carried out 4 main studies, and I'll have a look at those in a bit. So EVP, the sounds. So white noise is always associated with EVP, and white noise is a noise that consists of every frequency on the audio bandwidth at equal energy levels. It's perceived by the human ear as a hiss because each octave contains twice as many discrete frequencies as the one below it, and therefore seems louder. The lower frequencies are masked by the higher ones, thereby causing the perception of a hiss. Pink noise is similar to white noise, but it's deeper as it has a reduction in power at higher frequencies and an increase in power at lower frequencies. This makes it easier to listen to. It's less hard and hissy, and it's used in audio testing. I'll just play you a little clip of both so you can see what the difference is between the two. So this is the white noise. This is quite harsh. And this is the pink noise. You can see the pink noise is a bit easier to listen to, but I actually find that it's easier to make voices out of pink noise than it is out of white noise, because it's easier to listen to. So the method of actually recording EVPs is guaranteed to introduce a level of noise that increases the likelihood of hearing sounds that could be interpreted as EVP. So low frequency noise can be introduced from a number of sources, such as doors, water pipes, computer fans, electrical equipment. These ambient sounds can impinge on recordings and prevent analysis of the first speech formant, which will both prevent computer analysis of any apparent voice sounds heard, and it may also alter the perception of the sounds heard. If, for example, ghost hunters are using a tape recorder in a haunted building to record EVPs, the tape will contain white noise and machine sounds. If they're using a wired recorder, it may also record a 50 Hz mains hum. If someone then also records white noise as a carrier signal for the EVP, they'll have a large number of different noise sources, which will combine to produce a very noisy recording. And additionally, there may be a number of harmonics introduced, which all means the EVP tape could have a multitude of anomalous sounds on it before we even look at the possibility of a paranormal influence. The modern ghost boxes, which apparently produce EVP, as I said before, are simply radios that have been detuned to sweep through the radio band and pick up fragments of the radio stations as they sweep. The theory being that spirits causing the radio to stop at certain points to let the listener hear parts of words, which when pieced together form messages. Of course, the advantage with this method for the modern ghost hunter is that messages can be picked up in real time, allowing for apparent two-way conversation with the dead. And this is just an example of what these devices sound like. So you can see they are just picking up little tiny sections of radio broadcasts. Oops. Sorry, tried to switch slides and it's all going horribly wrong. There we go. So an important field to look at when we're looking at EVP is the field of auditory and speech perception. We can't look at EVPs without looking at this. So in certain circumstances, the brain can create missing portions of speech. It's called phonemic restoration. So it appears to the listener that the missing portions are actually present. This appears to be a method employed by the brain to allow for speech perception in less than optimal conditions, and appears particularly successful in creating the illusion of continuous speech when gaps in the speech are filled by white noise. If there are elements in EVP recordings that mimic speech sounds, it may be possible that this phonemic restoration effect causes listeners to create apparent words out of noise. One of the reported characteristics of EVP is that it can appear to be in multiple languages, but this might simply be that the brain is trying to create sense out of noise. So this is a sound clip where there's chunks taken out of it. See if you can work out what it says. Oops. So what it's actually saying is, do you understand what I'm trying to say? And as soon as you know that, it becomes obvious what it is. Some people can pick it up without being prompted, some can't. I must admit I'd forgotten what it said when I first played it, but it is quite striking sometimes when you hear these clips with chunks missing, how you can make out what the sentence says. So in normal human speech, strong syllables which contain a full vowel are usually found as the initial syllables of lexical words. Now, lexical words are ones which supply the meaning to the sentence. So, for example, answer, hold, very, yes. Grammatical words, which relate the lexical words to each other, are defined by having a weak syllable as their initial syllable. For example, giraffe. Weak syllables are also found in non-initial positions, for example, jumper. When speech is ambiguous, people will insert a speech boundary before a strong syllable and delete boundaries before a weak syllable. So I've got some examples here where you insert the word boundary before a strong signal. So analogy, which has got it in front of the weak one, you can interpret as an allergy, which then gives the boundary before a strong syllable. This is an example of inserting a boundary before a weak one is effective. You can interpret as effect of. Deleting a boundary before a strong syllable. Is he really? Israeli. And deleting a boundary before a weak syllable. My gorge is becomes my gorgeous. Some other examples of spontaneous slips of the ear are she's a must to avoid, she's a muscular boy, and I can't fit any more on. I can't fit any more on. So it's quite easy. It doesn't sound so good when someone's just saying these things out loud, but you can imagine in speech, and particularly if in a noisy environment, it's very easy to misinterpret these. This is just another example of interpreting speech according to our own personal bias. So the stakes are high, time is of the essence, and there's everything to lose. Completely different interpretation by the chef from the actual hostage situation. Also, the pronunciation of words within speech can vary according to a number of factors. So some words are not pronounced in the same way during casual speech as they are in formal speech. For example, the words this shop. In casual speech, these frequently are pronounced with a blending of the words to give a long S sound. So you'd say this shop rather than this shop. Vowel reduction is a process by which a vowel in an unstressed syllable may be reduced to the schwa sound, which is like a sound. For example, the A in about and the O in harmony. During faster speech, the schwa sound may be reduced or absent. So a vowel can be reduced to a schwa sound, but this schwa sound may itself be reduced or absent. And this effect varies between languages. In Spanish, reduced vowels still maintain their basic qualities, but in English, the reduced vowel sounds may be so distinctive as to become phonemes in their own right. And this variability in pronunciation, not only within but between languages, may affect what EVP experience report when faced with ambiguous signals. We also need to look at verbal transformations. So these are illusory changes in interpretation of a word or phrase when played repeatedly to participants. And these show the greatest distortions with simple stimuli. So you repeat something over and over and over again, and it then appears to change from one word to another or one sound to another. This may be a process that affects interpretations of EVPs, particularly as they tend to be short and are often played repeatedly to discern the meaning within them. Kondo and Kashino describe how noise present in daily life can affect how we hear signals, and they hypothesize that the brain needs to be able to create potential percepts from these ambiguous inputs and fluctuate between them in the manner described in the verbal transformation effect, And this will make perfect sense in the case of EVPers. There's also a potential priming effect that may be present in EVPers. Some approach an EVP session with a predefined idea of what might be said on tape. And even on ghost hunts, there seems to be an expectation that any spirits will be aggressive. It's been reported that speech perception rarely occurs in pure and non-noisy conditions. Listeners, use the syntax of sentences to create meaning in noisy conditions. Very few EVPs are produced in ghost hunting scenarios that contain full sentences, or even more than a word or two. But even a small number of words can be enough to provide syntactic meaning. For example, a sound that is interpreted as the word get is likely to have a subsequent sound interpreted as the word out, if the percipient is investigating a location that's had reports of an angry spirit that doesn't want visitors. So I've been looking at some of the vast quantity of EVPs available on YouTube as proof of the paranormal. And one of the biggest problems is that once someone's told you what you should be hearing, you can't hear anything else. There's loads of examples of these with songs online. My personal one was, there was a song on the radio when I was in school, and it was a Kenny Rogers song, "You Picked a Fine Time to Leave Me, Lucille." But the DJ sang along with the words, "You picked a fine time to leave me, loose wheel." And I've never been able to hear that song again without hearing the wrong words. So if participants are told what they should be expecting to hear before listening to a sound clip, they'll interpret the clip in the manner they've been prompted. Under seance room conditions, paranormal believers are more suggestible than non-believers, but only when the suggestion is consistent with the existence of paranormal phenomena. This effect is likely to extend to EVPers, recording sounds in paranormal locations being more likely to interpret sounds as paranormal in origin. So I've got some sound clips here for you to listen to. These clips have been made by investigators using the radio sweep technique. So there's definitely voices on the recordings, and they're definitely clips of radio stations, but the investigators believe that the spirits are manipulating the signals to form messages. Now, the first one the investigator believes is a spirit called Martin, which incidentally I've realised is a very popular name in the spirit world. There's a lot of clips containing Martin. On the initial listening, you can definitely hear Martin, although it does appear to be with an American accent, and both investigation and investigator were in the UK. So I'll play this first one. Play that again. Okay, says Martin. So if you manipulate the clip to try and separate out the individual elements of the word, you can hear that actually the second syllable isn't a T sound at all. It's more of a hard G sound. Let's play that again. So if you listen to that again at the correct speed, it sounds more like a D sound, but it's definitely a hard consonant sound. In fact, on repeated listening, it might even have an N in there as well. In fact, after a while, all I could hear was the American pronunciation of what we say in British English is duodenum, or it's pronounced in American English as duodenum. So rather than it being Martin saying his name, it might actually be a spirit with intestinal problems. I don't know. You listen and see if you can hear that when you hear it again. Who knows? But it's probably not Martin anyway. So another clip is stated as having the name Denise. So we'll listen to that. Okay, and again, if you isolate the clip and slow it down so you can hear the individual phonemes, it becomes apparent that there's no initial D sound at all. That's been filled in by the investigator due to the noisy background. So, in fact, I'd interpret that more like leave than Denise. So, perhaps the investigator just didn't want to take the hint and go. So why are people misinterpreting so badly? Well, as I mentioned before, the speech wave has a high degree of redundancy built in. It's pretty much designed so we can still recognise speech, even when there's background noise. If all but a small part of the speech spectrum is removed, a band of frequencies from 1,000 to 2,000 hertz is sufficient to give a sentence articulation score of about 90%. And when time amplitude variations in the waveform are destroyed by peak clipping, the original complex waveform of the speech wave can be reduced to a series of rectangular pulses, and the word articulation scores of 80 or 90% can still be obtained. So you can actually take quite a lot of the information out and people can still work out what the clip says. So I'm going to play some sine wave speech and see if you can work out what it is. So I'll play the first clip. Let's play that again. Okay, we'll play the same clip with slightly more information in it.
Sparkler. Sparkler. Sparkler.
Right, oops, oh dear. Okay, and then I'll play the full speech sound.
Sparkler. Sparkler. Sparkler.
So let's listen to that first one again and see if you can hear that now. So it should now be quite clear that that says sparkler. And if you ever hear that clip again, I guarantee you'll instantly know it says sparkler. The second clip you heard was noise for coded speech, and it stimulates what people with cochlear implants hear. So spectral characteristics such as harmonic structure, formant transitions, they're either eliminated or fundamentally altered. So acoustic features that are usually considered to be important acoustic correlates of phonetic content are not there, but you can still distinguish the word. On me. So the first clip you heard, as I said, was sine wave speech, which was synthesized by frequency modulating and amplitude modulating 3 sine waves. So they follow the frequencies and amplitudes of the first 3 formants, the resonant frequencies of the vocal tract. So it's effectively the vocal equivalent of a line drawing, but once you're primed, you could still make out the word. So most people who record EVPs use standard recording equipment due to the prohibitively high cost of professional recording equipment. Low frequency noise can be introduced from a number of sources, such as doors, water pipes, computer fans, electrical equipment. These kinds of ambient sounds can impinge on recordings and prevent analysis of the first speech formant, which will both prevent computer analysis of any apparent voice sounds heard, and may also, while listening to the sound clips, alter the perception of the sounds heard. The speech formants are the resonant frequencies of the vocal tract, and these resonance frequencies are changed by moving the lips and the tongues and any part of the vocal tract. And a point that most people recording EVP do not consider is the fact that tape recorders have a noise floor, the level of hiss or noise which is present on the tape recording. In standard recording equipment particularly, although high-end equipment can have this problem as well if it's not used correctly, this noise floor will consist of white noise and machine sounds. If the recorder is wired, as opposed to a battery operating device, it will also have a 50 Hz main hum in the cabling. If someone plays white noise as a carrier signal, then records on this recording device, it will potentially pick up the noise floor of the recorder, the white noise being played, and the noise floor present in the room. And all these noise sources combine to produce a very noisy recording. Plus there might be harmonics, so there'll be a multitude of anomalous sounds on the tape, even before you think about the paranormal. And this does apply to both analog and digital recordings. And another point to consider with digital recordings is that for reasons of file size, some recordings may use lossy compression, which may lose important data. And even lossless compression is unlikely to have been developed to retain important data regarding speech, as most commonly available compression has been developed to compress music and video, not speech. Ideally, a good quality external microphone should also be used. There is a good paper from 2021 available which compares recording devices and software if you want to start delving further into the effects that different methods of recording can have on linguistic interpretation. Most ghost hunters use home equipment, and that includes transferring any captured sound anomalies onto a computer to analyse the sounds. However, Plichter, a linguistics expert, states that PCI multimedia sound cards on home personal computers should not be used for this purpose, as they introduce electrostatic noise and distortion. So it's extremely unlikely that the ordinary ghost hunter will actually be interested in discovering the optimum method of obtaining EVPs because it's not straightforward and it's not cheap. So given all that, what have I actually done laboratory-wise? Well, it's the very beginning of a very long process, I suspect. But so far I've done 4 studies, 2 questionnaire ones and 2 using sound clips. So, study 1. The first problem I had when starting the research was to pin down exactly what is meant by the term EVP practitioner. And a very similar problem has emerged when trying to define the term paranormal believer, a construct that people are still arguing over today. Eventually, I devised a questionnaire which enabled me to distinguish between the people who didn't believe at all in the concept of EVP, people who believed in it but had never heard one or tried to obtain one, and people who had heard what they considered genuine EVP and used the technique to apparently communicate with the dead. It also allowed me to gather information on where and when people were using EVP techniques, how long do EVPs last, are they pleasant, are they threatening, and so gain a picture of the type and content of EVP experiences that people were having. I have analysed the findings from this questionnaire and, sorry, just bear with me, I'm not sure, let me just check what that is. There's my questionnaire. And okay, so I'm not actually going to go into statistical analysis, only because I personally fall asleep whenever there's lots of statistical numbers. So I've done pretty pictures, so you'll have to forgive me for it looking a bit like a child's television show, but it's slightly easier on the eye. So in this first study, paranormal beliefs have been shown to correlate with a number of personality variables, but previous research concentrated on a generalised aspect of the paranormal. So the purpose of this first study was to see if there were any differences, not only apparent between believers and skeptics, but also between EVPers and general paranormal believers. Participants were recruited from the student population, skeptics groups and paranormal conferences and online paranormal groups. So research usually concentrates on 2 main approaches, either attempting to show whether an apparent paranormal effect exists or not, for example, testing for psi effects, or alternatively examining personality correlates in an attempt to uncover why people believe in paranormal phenomena. And this research is generally dismissive of paranormal effects being genuine. The first problem with any type of research involving paranormal belief is trying to pin down exactly what paranormal belief might consist of and how to measure it. As we all know, there's still debates. I think there's going to be debates for quite some time yet. So what I was trying to look at is there something that causes people to actively look for this phenomenon of EVP rather than just believing in it? Another aspect I was looking at was after-death beliefs. If people are experiencing a phenomenon that they are interpreting as communication with the spirit world, it must be assumed that they believe in life after death, particularly as they report communication with spirits with unique identities. Previous research suggests that rather than having fixed beliefs in the afterlife, people create their own ideas, which can be fluid. For example, some people report believing that we go to heaven when we die, but when heaven becomes boring, we can become reincarnated. If these ideas can be fluid, then people may well be revising their beliefs according to the anomalous events they're experiencing. I did also look at personality differences, but there was nothing significant that came out of that. So this was the first thing I did, was creating a measure of EVP-ness, the tendency to believe in and use EVP. So 21 questions were devised with the assistance of practicing EVPers, and these were answered by all participants. They covered experience of the paranormal, membership of paranormal groups, frequency and methods of recording EVP, their reasons for recording EVP, the paranormal or non-paranormal nature of EVPs, and the remainder of this questionnaire was only to be answered by participants who had experienced EVP and contained questions such as how many times you experienced EVP that's personal to you, say from a relative or friend. They were also given the revised paranormal belief scale, the anomalous experiences inventory, the after-death belief scale, and the personality inventory, and some demographic measures, because I do believe in making participants work for it. So 63 questionnaire packs were distributed and 61 were returned completed. The sample was nearly equally split across gender, and the respondents were aged 24 to 79 years. The majority of the respondents were of Caucasian ethnicity, in full-time employment, and in general were educated to at least A-level or equivalent. So participants were originally going to be split into EVPers and non-EVPers, but I did realise this wouldn't capture everything required. So there were actually these three groups of people: those who didn't believe in it and hadn't experienced it, the non-EVPers; those who believed in it but hadn't experienced it, low EVPers; and those who believed in it and had experienced EVP, so the high EVPers. So using these three groups, I thought, well, it'll allow comparisons not just between people who believe in it and people who don't, but also between those who believed and those who actually experienced it. I selected a subset of questions that would allow scoring of participants into high, low or no belief in EVP, but I subsequently had to remove one of those because it was reverse scores, and it became apparent that hardly anyone had read it properly and they assumed it wasn't reverse scored, so I had to remove that one in the end. So you have to excuse my terrible pictures, but there's three pictures at the top. The Ghostbuster symbol is people who don't believe, one ghost is believe in EVP, and three ghosts is believe in EVP and experienced it. So traditional religious belief, belief in psi, belief in spiritualism, and belief in precognition, they're all significantly higher in low and high EVPers and non-EVPers, but there were no differences between low and high EVPers. Superstition is highest in the low EVPers. Now, the low EVPers may be displaying this higher superstition in certain actions. For example, it's common in amateur ghost hunting groups for participants to recite prayers of protection before beginning an investigation in case they attract malevolent spirits, which could be thought of as a form of superstition. However, it might be argued that the scale doesn't actually measure superstition as a complete concept, as the only questions related to superstition are concerned with bad luck, whereas superstition also covers positive effects, for example, using a birth date as lottery numbers, believing they'll bring good luck. The superstition subscale has also been criticised because the questions are concerned with cognition, so whether someone intellectually believes in a concept rather than behaviour, whether someone carries out the action. And it may be the results might be different if questions were asked about behaviour. For example, I don't think of myself as particularly superstitious. However, I still find myself touching wood to avoid invoking fate. It might have been expected that high EVPers would show the highest level of superstition. Lindemann and Arnio suggested that a number of beliefs that have previously been classed as paranormal, magical superstitions are not actually superstitions at all, but unsubstantiated beliefs. They give the examples of graphology and biorhythms, but if we class EVPs under this category of unsubstantiated beliefs, it might explain why high EVPers did not score significantly higher than the other two groups in the study, as actually the superstition scale is measuring a different construct. Anomalous and paranormal experiences are significantly higher between non-EVPers and high EVPers. Beliefs are significantly higher in both low and high EVPers compared with the non-EVPers. And the ability is significantly higher in the high EVPers than the non-EVPers, all of which we'd expect, as the high EVPers are experiencing more apparent paranormal phenomena because they're collecting these EVPs. Now, the EVPers appear to show a number of after-death beliefs, some of which may not appear to be compatible with each other. So disembodied spirit, spiritual embodiment, reincarnation, and belief behaviour efficacy were all significantly higher in low and high EVPers than in the non-EVPers. So a form of disembodied spirit is necessarily required for the concept of EVP as communication with spirit. However, it was slightly surprising, as disembodied spirit is a concept of consciousness continuing after death in the absence of the identity. This finding would suggest that whilst high EVPers are hearing EVPs, they're not necessarily interpreting them as specific identities, for example, friends or relations, who are still individuals as they were before death. This may be because whilst they're retaining more EVPs and distinguishing between them, they cannot assign them to specific people. This is something I'm going to have to look at in more detail, because I can try and compare the after-death beliefs with the EVPers' descriptions of the type of EVP they obtain. Both spiritual embodiment and reincarnation was significantly higher for the low and high EVPers and for the non-EVPers. The spiritual embodiment finding was totally expected, because this is the idea that both the identity and the consciousness of a person survives death, and this belief is required to explain the results of a number of reports from both the earlier EVP researchers, who report hearing the voices of relative friends or famous people, and recent EVP researchers who report hearing friends and famous people, even such as Jesus Christ. Reincarnation finding was slightly surprising, with belief in reincarnation increasing significantly as EVP-ness increased. This was surprising because the belief that consciousness survives and returns to a new body with a different identity wouldn't seem to make sense in the context of EVP. However, it may be that EVPers can believe in both. It may be that they believe both scenarios may happen, and a voice they pick up via EVP may be of a spirit that at some point will lose its consciousness and return in a new body. Belief behaviour efficacy is a belief that actions and beliefs affect what happens to someone after death, and again was significantly higher in EVPers than non-EVPers. This might be tied to the fact that EVPers also displayed a higher level of belief in traditional religious beliefs, as a recurring theme in religion is the belief that how you act in life will influence what happens to you after death. Low EVP has also displayed a relatively high level of superstitious beliefs, so possibly superstition causes them to carry out actions to prevent harm in this life, and belief behaviour efficacy causes them to carry out actions to prevent harm after death. As expected, the non-EVP group showed a significantly higher level of belief in annihilation. So the concept that there's no afterlife, when we're dead, we're dead. I'm glad that none of the EVP has showed that. That would have been awkward to explain. So I moved on to study 2. So study 1 concentrated mainly on paranormal and after-death beliefs. So study 2 was designed to look at individual differences that have been described in the literature as being indicative of a tendency to believe in and experience apparently paranormal phenomena. So the first factor looked at was schizotypy. So schizotypy is a personality type that has been described as varying along a continuum, or sometimes more than one continuum, but I'll just put it in really simple terms, from normal through affective disorder to the upper reach of the scale, where a second continuum encompasses clinical psychosis and schizophrenia. One of the factors contained in the schizotypy construct is unusual experiences, which appears to describe anomalous experiences such as hallucinations. People who score highly on this unusual experiences scale have been termed positive schizotypes. People scoring highly on the scale but also being mentally healthy and showing high levels of well-being have been described as happy schizotypes. These happy schizotypes report experiencing anomalous events but have higher levels of mental health and well-being than other types. Schizotypy has been reported to be a predictor of both someone experiencing a paranormal event and then interpreting that event as a paranormal one. They're also more likely to report hallucinatory experiences and unusual cognitive and perceptual experiences than normal controls. Schizotypes have also been described as experiencing voices which have an external source. Also in this study, I looked at reality testing, the ability to differentiate between representations of the external world and representations of the internal world. In the formation of delusions, individuals can give more weight to the evidence of their senses and form a belief to support this sensory evidence, rather than in trying to fit their experience into more mainstream ideas of the nature of reality. According to Irwin, Dagwall and Drinkwater, there are 2 processes involved in experiencing a paranormal event: a proneness to anomalous experiences and a proneness to paranormal attributions. It might be expected that people reporting EVP experiences show a deficit in reality testing, as they're attributing and interpreting sounds in a paranormal fashion. Dissociative experiences are also present in the general non-clinical population, and one type of dissociative experience is auditory hallucinations. Irwin also described a correlation between higher dissociation scores and spiritualism. I also looked at fantasy proneness, another trait that's been experienced as a factor in psychic experiences and paranormal experiences. I looked at hallucination process. A definition of auditory verbal hallucination is a sensory experience which occurs in the absence of corresponding external stimulation of the relevant sensory organ, has a sufficient sense of reality to resemble a veridical perception over which the subject does not feel they have direct and voluntary control, and which occurs in a wake state. It might be expected that proponents of EVP might be described as displaying hallucination proneness, and paranormal believers have previously been shown to be more likely to report a signal within noise, particularly in uncertain conditions such as a paranormal investigation. However, this could be simplistic, as there is considerable research concerning the perception of ambiguous stimuli, which combined with personality factors may suggest that the combination of the human propensity for recognizing speech in noisy conditions, hallucination proneness and paranormal belief may all contribute towards the EVP proponent reporting voices. Death anxiety was also looked at, the apprehension felt when considering the awareness of the inevitability of death. Given that EVP appears to prove that there is life after death, EVPers may display a lower level of death anxiety as they are convinced that there is life after death. However, it might be the opposite, as a number of ghost hunters report negative EVP experiences. Bentall and Slade described hallucinations being reported in the general population, not in a paranormal context, and report that around 5% of participants will report hallucinatory auditory experiences when they're presented with the suggestion that there might be a stimulus present. Given this, it might be expected that EVPers would display impaired reality testing compared to skeptics. So for this study, 142 participants took part. There were 71 male, 71 female, and they range from 19 to 81 years old. So the schizotypy. So people who score highly on the unusual experiences factor of the schizotypy construct report anomalous experiences such as hallucinations. Both the low and the high EVPers showed significantly higher scores than the non-EVPers. But again, there was no difference between low and high EVPers, suggesting that EVP-ness didn't affect the scores, and it was more likely to be a general belief in the paranormal that caused this result. And females also scored more highly on this scale, which does reflect previous research. Reality testing, again, both low and high EVPers scored significantly higher than non-EVPers, showing that both displayed a reality testing deficit when compared with non-EVPers, and will both believe in the paranormal and display hallucinations. Again, this is particularly relevant in the area of EVP, as suggestion is a factor often involved when interpreting sound clips, and it's been shown that hallucinators are more willing to believe stimuli are present in sound clips. There were no significant results for the dissociation. Both high and low EVPers displayed higher fantasy proneness when non-EVPers. So when looking at hallucinations as a whole, high EVPers scored significantly higher than non-EVPers. When the scale was split into the 4 subscales of hallucination, high EVPers scored significantly higher on the sleep-related scale than non-EVPers, and females scored higher than males. Both low and high EVPers displayed higher levels of auditory hallucination than non-EVPers, again with females scoring higher than males. So there must be another factor that causes high EVPers to go out and seek these anomalous voices, as both low and high EVPers are just as likely to report hearing voices. Maybe low EVPers have just not had the opportunity to put this into practice. And there were no significant results from the death anxiety scale. So similar to study 1, the overall results showed that the scales measured are not able to distinguish between low and high EVPers, but they do distinguish between EVPers and non-EVPers. This is due to both the EVP groups displaying a higher level of paranormal belief and experience, rather than due to any intrinsic EVP factor. There might be a confounding factor in that in recent years, the use of a number of EVP techniques has increased significantly. And instead of EVP techniques only being used by a specialised subject of people, it's now far more mainstream, and every ghost hunter uses a technique as a standard part of a ghost hunt. This could lose any subtle differences that might have previously been seen between low and high EVPers, as essentially everyone is a potential high EVPer nowadays. So on the downside, it doesn't seem possible to distinguish between paranormal believers who use EVP as a technique and paranormal believers who do not. But on the plus side, the results have replicated previous results shown between paranormal believers and non-believers. There could be a number of factors why some believers seek out the anomalous voices, from a desire to prove that the paranormal exists, trying to establish that there's life after death and what, pardon me, what life after death might consist of. So there's plenty of scope for future projects to ascertain what drew EVP practitioners to the technique in the first place and what makes them continue to use it, allowing for the fact that it's a standard technique used on ghost hunts nowadays, which could be a confounding factor. So, study 3. Things started to get a bit difficult here. So this study looked at how participants responded in an auditory listening task. It proved very difficult to obtain non-believers for the study. Despite approaching skeptic groups, no non-believing participants were willing to take part. It was also difficult to recruit believers, as whilst there were plenty of willing participants, due to the fact that the study had to be carried out using the same equipment for each participant, it was only possible to use participants who either lived within a reasonable radius or who were at conferences. And sadly, a number of overseas participants had to be turned down as they didn't have the funds to travel abroad and no one would fund me. So there is some evidence that brain networks are disturbed when an individual experiences an auditory verbal hallucination, or AVH. There is some similarity between the reports of AVHs and the reports of EVP voices. For example, if hallucinating patients are asked to imagine a voice, they will not experience it as a hallucination. It has to appear out of control of the percipient. This mimics reports of EVP, which are reported as being spontaneous. While the participants may ask for the voices to appear, they do not try and create them. The phenomenon of hearing voices reported by EVP experiencers, however, have an extra component, that of manifesting over a noisy background. It may be that EVPers show two different mechanisms, a propensity to hallucinate caused by non-clinical brain disturbances, overlaid with a tendency to misperceive random noise and interpret it as paranormal due to top-down processing. Previous studies have shown that participants with high levels of hallucination proneness, who display impairments in source monitoring under normal conditions, may be persuaded into a full hallucination by cues and context. It is described how contextual factors could include how likely the individual is to think that a perceptual event might occur, and this may continually change according to the conditions and hence explain how they experience events. This might explain why high EVPers frequently report hearing voices, particularly in a haunted building, why their interpretation of a number of external factors may be influenced by not just the location they're in, but also the responses of the people around them. So the listening task itself utilised pink noise and pink noise overlaid with speech files. Additionally, the participants were told that either the task was a standard auditory task or that the task contained EVPs. They also completed a subset of the questionnaires from studies 1 or 2. So bear with me 1 second. Sorry about that. I've had something approaching flu for 2 weeks. So this was the point I realised that although I'd said as an undergraduate that I was never, ever, ever going to do signal detection ever again, suddenly half my PhD was dependent on it. So the result of the personality measures, they were also subject to some of the personality measures that studies 1 and 2 have been asked to do. There was no difference between low and high EVPers. Again, remembering there were no non-believers in the sample because they all refused to take part. So the group who were told that the task was a simple auditory task were more likely to respond that they heard a voice than the group who were told the task was an EVP task. Originally, it had been hypothesised that high EVPers were more likely to report voices, particularly if they were told the task was an EVP one. This was shown not to be true. In fact, not only were high EVPers no more likely to report hearing a voice, but all groups were less likely to report hearing a voice when they were told that the task was an EVP one. This might be because the high EVP participants believe that there's more at stake when the possibility of the paranormal is introduced, and they don't want to make mistakes and show that they're confabulating voices, so they raise their criterion value. The same might be true of low EVPers. They have less experience in EVP, but again do not want to appear to endorse a paranormal explanation to a phenomenon. Females are overall less likely to be able to distinguish a signal from noise. This might be due to the level of background noise present in the clips. Males have been shown to be able to tolerate a higher intensity of background noise level than females while still being able to interpret a signal. So they are more likely to be able to hear voices within voice clips. In contrast, females displayed a lower criterion, meaning that they were more likely to reply that they'd heard a voice within the noise. This does contradict previous research, which showed that higher scores on the unusual experiences subscale were more likely to report hearing a voice, but also reported that females were more conservative in their responses. However, as the females display higher UE scores than males, it makes sense that in study 3, they also displayed a less conservative criterion. So the group most likely to report hearing voices in noise were females in the non-EVP task, and the group least likely to report hearing voices were males in the EVP task. The females were no more likely than the males to be high EVPers, which again reinforces the finding that EVP-ness does not have an effect on the tendency to report voices within noise, and the underlying factors are more likely to be related to gender and suggestion. So it was interesting that the skeptics weren't willing to take part. It might be that they don't see the point. One personal communication I have wondered about the validity of researching a phenomenon that does not exist. Or perhaps it might be that the skeptics are unwilling to take part in studies such as this, as it might produce results that don't correspond with their worldview. A 2009 study reported how skeptics can offer an explanation for apparent paranormal events without actually explaining anything, and perhaps being in a position where the researcher could be thought of as an authority figure might mean the skeptic is worried that they might be uncovered as not having the knowledge to explicitly explain away the phenomenon. I should explain, when I say skeptic, I don't mean in the traditional sense where you're looking at all the evidence and forming an opinion based on that. These are the skeptics who just basically say everything to do with the paranormal is automatically rubbish and refuse to even look at it. So the last study, study 4, this was a replication of the previous task, but I also included the variable of handedness. So handedness has been suggested to affect language processing. It's been reported that around 90% of right-handers display a left brain dominance in speech, and only 70% of left-handers display this dominance. Additionally, the percentage of right brain hemisphere language lateralization is higher in left-handers than right-handers compared to the usual left hemisphere language lateralization. This same atypical pattern is also displayed in schizophrenics, with clinical patients displaying both non-right-handedness and right hemisphere language lateralization. So it has been reported that a reduced language lateralization can be a trait marker for auditory hallucinations in a clinical schizophrenic population, although this might not be the case for a healthy population. However, it should be noted that previous research has shown that hallucination can be correlated with positive healthy schizotypy, so it's reasonable to assume that this reduced lateralization might be present in a healthy population of paranormal believers and EVP practitioners. It's been reported that if auditory hallucinations are due to internal misrepresentation of speech generated by the left temporal lobe, then hallucinating patients should struggle to identify external speech when presented to the right ear, as this speech will be processed by the left hemisphere leading to a decrease in lateralization. Right ear responses are more common both when a voice is present and when a voice is absent. This also occurs when asking a participant to imagine hearing a voice, with the imaginary voice being reported in the right ear more frequently than the left. This study was slightly different to the current one in that participants were informed that every trial would contain a voice. So to explain this, structurally, auditory input to the right ear reaches the left linguistic hemisphere directly, and this drives an attentional bias to the right ear. So some studies have reported no correlation between apparent asymmetry and scores in the unusual experiences scale. However, one study reports that high scorers on the scale report more words that are not actually present, as well as more abstract words. It's suggested that hallucinators are more likely in the presence of ambiguous external stimuli, similar to the white noise that was used, which would almost also mimic the EVP model, where a combination of environmental stimuli and white noise could combine to produce the illusion of voices. Of course, there's also a population of mixed handers who don't show a hand preference for tasks, and these have been shown to display higher schizotypy scores as well as less brain lateralization. The evidence for gender differences is disputed, with some reports that females display greater left than right brain activity, and other reports stating this is more likely due to neuronal plasticity, due to life experiences and gender roles rather than in fact of biological sex. So, study 4 asked the participants not only to discern if a voice was present in noise or not, but also, if they did hear a voice, which direction it was coming from. The sound clips were manipulated so that the voice would be presented to either the left ear, the right ear, or from the centre. Again, the participants were either told it was an auditory task or that the clips contained EVP. It had been expected that high EVPers would be less likely to report a voice in their right ear, whether this was real or not. And this wasn't shown to be true. There weren't actually any differences between the groups. This might have been due to the fact that there was only a very small number of high EVPers and a very small number of non-EVPers who took part. I actually managed to get some non-EVPers to take part, but it was a tiny number. However, it might also be due to other confounding factors. For example, second language acquisition has been described as affecting brain laterality. Now, the effect of task instruction that was shown in study 3 wasn't shown in study 4. Again, this might have been due to the low numbers of non and high EVPers, or it might have been that the increased cognitive load of asking participants to listen to voices coming from different directions was enough to concentrate all participants on the task, so they wouldn't show criterion differences between the two conditions. It's possible that when the task consists simply of being asked if a voice is present or not, and being told it's an EVP task or not, allows participants to assume that there might not be a voice present and display a more conservative criterion. However, when the additional requirement of deciding which direction the voice is coming from is added, it may be that participants are less likely to be concerned about the fact that the voice may or may not be paranormal, and are more focused on deciding where the voice is coming from. There were no significant differences between strong and weak right-handers when looking at the hit rate, sensitivity and criterion, suggesting that there was no difference in how participants were deciding to respond. Again, this was not unexpected, as this was not looking specifically at which ear the participants were favouring. It was simply assessing if there were any general differences in whether they reported hearing a voice or not. So the high hallucinators were more likely to report hearing a voice if it was not directional, if it came from the centre rather than the left or right. And this was found regardless of whether the centre response was correct or incorrect. So whilst they were more likely to respond centre, they were also more likely to respond centre correctly. So, as I mentioned before, the previous studies have shown that voices are more commonly hallucinated in the right ear, due to a right ear advantage utilising the left speech hemisphere of the brain. It can be assumed that high hallucinators have less laterality in their brain speech areas due to correlating factors such as high schizotypy. So it will make sense that they would be more likely to report voices in the centre, as they don't have the right ear advantage, but their speech areas are shared more between the brain hemispheres. Of course, this must be balanced again against other reasons that can affect the brain laterality, such as high schizotypy, language acquisition, and brain sex differences. High hallucinators were also more likely to report a voice in the left ear as coming from the centre. Interestingly, there was no corresponding reporting of right ear sounds coming from the centre. The high hallucinators were also more likely to hallucinate a voice in their right ear than low hallucinators. Previous studies have found that hallucinations are, as stated, more commonly reported coming from the right, regardless of the handedness of participants. And however, hallucinations in general are more likely to occur on the right side, including things like phantom limb syndrome, out-of-body experiences, and reports of a sense of presence. The high auditory hallucinators were significantly more likely to not hear a stimulus in either their right or left ear, and this is similar to the high overall hallucinators, but rather than showing a positive bias to the centre as the overall hallucinators did, the high auditory hallucinators showed a negative ability to hear directional sounds. Weak right-handers were more likely to correctly report hearing a voice in their left ear. It was expected they'd be less likely to report hearing a voice in their right ear, which was true, but it was not expected that they would also display such a left ear advantage. So most of the studies that have been done so far looking at right ear advantage have concentrated on dichotic listening tasks, which does make direct comparisons difficult. The dichotic tasks ignore the possibility that the participants might report a sound as being perceived centrally, even if it's being presented directionally. There's been a negative priming effect reported in listening tasks, which might have an effect if we assume that a noise stimulus in one ear has been ignored. Then the participant might be more likely to ignore a further stimulus in the same ear if the speech is embedded at an ambiguous level. So the results of the 4 studies have shown that it may not be possible to distinguish between groups of participants by using a simple measure of EVP-ness, whether they believe in EVP, believe and have experience, or whether they disbelieve. This may well be due to the phenomenon being an as yet under-researched one, necessitating more qualitative studies to ascertain the underlying foundations of the belief that an individual is contacting the spirit world. One of the biggest issues is that most research so far has concentrated on auditory hallucinations rather than auditory illusions. Much more research needs to be conducted on illusions and how the brain constructs speech from random noise in order to further explain why EVPers misinterpret random noise as voices speaking to them. This may demonstrate that whilst there may be a common basis between hallucinations in a clinical population and the voices reported by EVPers, there might be a specialised pathway consisting of misperception and illusion that's driving the reports of apparent voices. Previous studies report that paranormal belief may be a predictor of pathological personality traits. However, the current study demonstrated that the personality variables investigated didn't show this hypothesized result. This might support the position that belief in EVP voices doesn't predict these personality variables, and may therefore indicate another cause for belief in EVP voices that might be totally unrelated to paranormal belief. In this case, future studies will benefit from ascertaining any physical factors that might predispose to hearing the voices, as it does not appear that EVP-ness can be distinguished using general personality traits. These findings were also reported from the audio studies, Whilst there were some small differences seen between groups, there were no overall results that could be used to describe EVPers as a separate group distinguishable from non-EVPers. Whilst the results obtained don't show differences in EVPers, this can still be regarded as providing useful information regarding EVPness, as it shows that EVPness isn't dependent on personality factors in the same way that paranormal belief has been reported. This might suggest it's a completely separate factor, and it may encompass the physical factors of hearing and interpretation rather than being personality traits. This might also extend to the non-believers, and there may prove to be a commonality in interpretation of sound clips regardless of beliefs. There may have been an issue with the definition of EVP practitioner used in these studies. Previously, EVP practitioners were a defined subset of people who dedicated time to researching and obtaining these anomalous voices. However, in recent years, a form of EVP technique has become popular that might be masking effects. The two types of investigator appear to have very differing approaches to the subject. The ghost hunters trying to obtain evidence of the paranormal, and the traditional EVP practitioner is trying to obtain descriptions of life after death. Additionally, there's also a number of people who attend organised ghost hunts for entertainment purposes. However, these events are advertised as being genuine, so participants believe that they've heard the genuine voices of the dead. It might prove impossible to untangle the different types of belief and experience. However, it might be worth ignoring the sceptical side for future studies, no matter how much I want to try and prove that the skeptics are wrong as well. I'm just concentrating on an attempt to distinguish the different types of EVP and look at factors that might be common under EVPers. Also, there needs to be more research done on the interpretation of sound clips. There have been some research studies over the years looking at interpretation of signals in noise, but it might be worth starting with a simple study to ascertain how people interpret a number of really simple signals and building it up from there. You could start with a range of simple words or short phrases, assess how people report these. Then you can add context, including priming and suggestion, and see how that affects the reporting. Just a little bit of bonus content. So the majority of EVP experiences were described as lasting between 1 and 2 seconds. 90% are less than 5 seconds. And EVP practitioners who describe carrying out their experiments in a scientific fashion describe receiving long messages via EVP. So the more amateur EVPers seem to be receiving much shorter messages. The majority of the EVP voices are reported as being from someone that the EVPer didn't know. This would make sense in the ghost hunting context, as the locations that are generally investigated are outside the EVPer's home location, usually consisting of any reportedly haunted location. A small percentage of people reported hearing EVP voices of someone they knew was still alive at the time of the recording. This is interesting, as it appears to be at odds with the usual explanation for EVP that their voice is from the spirit world. 15% of participants reported hearing a voice that appeared to be their own. This might suggest that there may be some influence of schizotypy among these participants, and they may be externalizing their internal voice. Nearly a third of participants reported that they'd recorded a voice of someone that they subsequently learned was not alive at the time of the EVP. And this mimics the phenomenon of people reported seeing apparitions of someone who they subsequently discovered had died. Nearly half the participants report that the EVP voices respond to commands and actions. Of course, this might just be assigning causality to events, particularly if coincidental events occur. For instance, asking the spirit to make a sound, and a natural sound occurs straight away. This can be misinterpreted as the spirit answering. The majority of EVPers report their experiences as being positive and friendly, which might suggest they're using the technique as a coping mechanism that allows allows them to cope with the uncontrollability of life, if you subscribe to Irwin's views. Or if not, it might just be that spirits are happy. There don't seem to be any specific messages being imparted. Most reported that the messages they receive have no importance to themselves, their paranormal investigation group, if they have one, or to the world in general. This is at odds to a number of well-known researchers who report that the message have great importance regarding life after death. And this might just be because the majority of practitioners are using it as a ghost hunting tool. So a final word for the skeptics who wouldn't take part and don't think it exists. If you're only skeptical of things that contradict your already established beliefs, you're not making the most of your skepticism. And thank you very much for listening. And my voice has just about lasted out. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Anne. That was really wonderful. I love the way that you showed the statistical results as well, because I mean, I did a lot of stats in my past, but I like that a lot better. It's much better to see that kind of a presentation. I think you still get the message, and it's not as like perceptually daunting to try and figure out what's happening. But really wonderful. I wanted to, there was a question that I had right there that went away. Every time, I've been watching a lot of these shows about ghosts and stuff over the years. And especially in the movies, they'll depict a group of investigators leaving a recording setup somewhere in the haunted location and then going away and coming back the next day or earlier in the morning or sometime during an overnight vigil to grab that material. And I'm wondering if there's a difference between how those kinds of unattended recordings are handled by the investigators and whether or not they're more difficult, because I would imagine they would pick up more ambient noises and things like that people wouldn't be able to identify. I just wondered if there's a difference between that, or if that's just a Hollywood, depiction of how investigators handle the EVP.
Yeah, some investigators certainly use that technique, but like you just alluded to there, if you're present, if someone makes a sound and you can make a note of that, whereas if there's nobody there, you've got no idea. So yeah. If you've got animals or insects or anything making a noise, you've got no record of that. So possibly if you used video recording as well, but I still don't think it's the best way. And plus, traditionally, EVP was always used as a technique for contacting the dead, and you're not contacting them if you're just leaving something and walking away and leaving it. There's no interaction there.
Right, exactly. No prompt, and it doesn't fit the belief model. The other thing I was wondering about is Cardania and Palmer and Murkison and Clavert's, their handbook for parapsychology for the 21st century had a chapter in there from Dr. Leary from Duke University on EVP, and I read it, but I don't have a background in EVP, and I wondered if you had looked at it and could let us know whether or not you thought that was useful. It seemed to. It was very well written, I thought, and interesting to take a look at, but I was worried about I had never heard of him. I know he was collaborating with somebody that had a lot of experience, I think Tom Butler, in doing EVPs over here, but he himself, I don't think, had so much experience himself. And so I just wondered if you had an opinion about that chapter, if you'd read it.
I think all the research that's trying to do it in a scientific fashion is valid. With experience, I mean, there's generally a level of experience you need before you start getting results, which doesn't happen with the ghost hunters, which is why I've tended to concentrate more on the ghost hunters, because it's obvious that they're misperceiving, and that gives us something to look at and study. Whereas the people who are doing it more seriously, you do have to sit and you do have to keep doing the same thing until you start getting results. So I think any results that are reported are valid for looking at, and they all add to our knowledge of what's going on. You just have to be careful to look at how these things have been done. Like I said in my talk, I went to one study that was being carried out in supposedly scientific fashion. Can't even remember who was there. There were a few of us there. Terence Palmer was there and some other people were there. But then the whole day was completely ruined because the investigator sent us the sound clips and said, have a listen to these. And the file name was what was supposedly in there. So that was a complete waste of my time traveling the country and spending a day there. So
yeah. Yeah, it's amazing how once you've heard something or you've been told what you should hear, that you can never unhear it again, even if it's a while later and you've forgotten that experience. You're still somewhere in your brain. You've got that Post-it note that reminds you that no, the guy's saying sparkler, okay? So you're not gonna get something else. It's interesting. I know when you did the dissociation stuff, I think did you skip over that or did I just space out? I'm just interested in that because Corliss and I found, we're always looking at dissociation in relationship to various psychic experiences, in general psychic experiences, and found dissociative tendencies that were not diagnostic. They didn't go up to the diagnostic area where you've got a problem with dissociative experiences, but more like what artists and creatives would have. So similar to the happy schizotypic kind of idea.
Yeah, I didn't really find anything exciting at all with the dissociative
experiences,
unfortunately. Most of the study has been no.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, it's fascinating, and I think it's a really wonderful thing to do, to get very systematic about this and how it's, what are the other alternative things that need to be thought about in terms of the way the brain works with sound and where it's coming from and so on. And I found, though, I'm left-handed, so of course I found that to be really interesting. And I was trying to think about it. Periodically, I have heard like my mother's calling my name or something like that over the years, sounds in the house, stuff like that, and trying to think about what ear I was hearing it from. And in general, it was the left ear. So when I was at a distance, it was usually the right ear. But when I was heard something very close by, it always seemed to be like the left ear. So I don't know why, if that's something to do with the fact that I'm a lefty, and I'm more of an ambiguous lefty than I am a true lefty. My father and my grandfather were both ambidextrous, and I think my grandfather came by it honestly, and my father sort of refused to work with his right hand all the time, and kicked up a fuss in the grade schools when he was young about being forced to use his right hand to write and so on. And he protected me, when he realized that I was a left-hander, he wouldn't let them, because that was, even when I was a kid, that was something that they did, was if you were a left-hander, they tried to unleft-hand you in the class. And he made that clear that was not going to be tolerated if anybody tried that. So I thought that was very interesting, because it's not a variable that people think of using. And I think it's, especially from some of the research that you were talking about, it seems to be very important to take a look at left-handedness, right-handedness, and ambidextrous folk.
Yes, depressingly, there's just so much research still to be done, though. I mean, there's
Yeah.
so many studies. This is just like the very, very start of the beginning.
But it's wonderful. I mean, I think what you've done is a very foundational kind of piece of work that's that's out there now. It's permanent. So that's a wonderful contribution. And having too much research to do in your future is also kind of a happy accident, even if you never live to be 150 to get it all done, right? So I think that's excellent. Does anybody have any outside of, it's so informative? Thank you so much, and interesting presentation. And Elizabeth, who had to leave early, was really depressed about it because she was really interested in the entire topic, and I'm sure she's going to come back and watch the video multiple times. But does anybody else have any comments or questions that you want to ask? Brian, have you got something on your mind?
Yeah, I would agree with you that this is kind of like a foundational thing. And that's what I really admire about your work, Anne, is that, I think it's important to look at these other factors. A lot of the studies that have been done in relation to EVP have been done in kind of more on the proof-oriented side. And this is kind of a step going in the process-oriented direction, kind of semi-process oriented, in looking at psychological correlates and even neuropsychological ones as well. And even though that's process oriented, it may have implications for the proof oriented question, because it goes into the factors. Well, what exactly goes into the way the people hear and interpret EVP, and is that a possible alternate compared to the question whether they are voices of the dead? So it's you kind of have to weigh both sides, and one of the only ways we can do that is through studying what people experience when they first interpret or hear and interpret an EVP. So that's where I really see the value of what you're doing here, because it has kind of, in some ways, two uses. It kind of helps us evaluate the proof-oriented question a little bit better, and it also, it also helps us understand a little bit more about what may be going on when people describe and having experiences of EVP, and kind of dwelling on the processes involved.
Yes, thank you for that. It's just got so much more complicated in recent years, though. As I was saying before, it was almost easier previously because you had people who experienced EVP and were trying to obtain EVP, and you had people who didn't, whereas now absolutely everyone goes, oh, EVP, and people who've never even had anything to do with the paranormal field will go on ghost hunts and go, oh, EVP. So the waters are a lot more muddy than they used to be. But
yeah,
I think that supports the fact that we need to be looking more at why people are interpreting things in certain ways, because certainly on the ghost hunts, people are completely misinterpreting sounds. So if we can understand how that works as a base and then move on to the more real EVP, shall we say, that people
right, exactly. Yeah, your research is very, very important for that kind of zeroing in on something that may really be paranormal and really have some kind of objectivity to it, and not be. I mean, I would imagine. I have to say, as a younger person, I avoided every single possible opportunity to go and do a ghost hunting vigil. I missed a pile of things, and when I was in college, and Brenda Dunn was one of my college pals. She and our professor went on a number of these things and got to know a lot of the ghost hunters that were around at that point in Chicago. And I would be, oh gosh, I think I have the flu. Oh gosh, I have a paper to write. I just absolutely avoided it all the time. At the same time, I'm fascinated by the reports, and I'm fascinated by listening to people who are coming back from an investigation and talking about what happened. So I don't know why I'm such a chicken, but but I am. Speaking of things that you're not quite sure what they are, one of the first times that we were, Carlos and I worked at the Parapsychology Foundation in New York City for a while, and one of the first lectures before the lecture got started, or it could have even been a workshop Carlos and I were doing on ghosts and hauntings. The pipes started banging like I've never heard pipes bang before, and we both had this kind of moment like, oh my God, what's going on here? And then Lizette was done. No, it's old pipes. That's what it was. So there's when you're new and you're nervous, you're gonna take in all of these noises in a way that would be very difficult to kind of sort out or think about in a rational way, because you're just like keyed up to be hearing something that's paranormal, and the experience or the environment is very conducive to that. So that's interesting too to me. The people that are the newbies going out on investigations, and the people who are tourists basically in the same experience, and then the folks that are experienced and know what they're doing, and they have a way of going through these things, and like you have gone through many of these experiences and investigated them and so on. So there's such a different cognitive context as well for the people that may be reporting these things.
You might enjoy this little story. We were staying in a Scottish castle, a group of us, and we set up a Victorian seance. But it was a faked Victorian seance. So we had things on bits of fishing wire, and we had drawers that had opened and closed. And everyone was totally taken in by it. They were absolutely, oh God, what's that? What's that? Even when somebody accidentally nearly knocked out the drawer they were pushing and went, oops, nobody even spotted it. But what was interesting was while we were in the middle of it, there were footsteps going across the ceiling upstairs. Now, none of the people who were in the seance going, oh, this is really scary, even spotted those. But we did, because we knew there was nobody upstairs at the time.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my God. Yeah. So there's so much of us around that comes from experience, and knowing what that the small little thing that has some info behind it can be really disturbing and really exciting than the other stuff. And we had a similar touristy experience in Tulloch Castle, where the folks that own that place brought you into the main ballroom, shut off all the lights, and then told you the story about somebody that had, fallen off a staircase or gone off the turret or something like that. And of course, they had somebody from the grounds people outside ready to open all the windows at the same time, so the wind would come in and freeze us to death while we were all standing there in the darkness. And it was a lot of fun. And Carlos and I were kind of like, oh well, this is not going to give us any, oh, are you kidding? We were like, oh, up halfway up the ceiling like everybody else when they did that. It was a lot of fun. And then a little annoyed, because we were like, well, look at what we do for a living, and we've been here for 2 days and we haven't seen this girl that threw herself off the parapet or whatever. So it's interesting, and it's very important. I think your presentation reminds me of Beth Darlington's, about other kinds of things that investigators can run into that may have a normal explanation, and how you have to have all of these things in mind as you're being an investigator. And that also takes quite a lot of time to have that as your craft experience, and something that you do as second nature, and don't have to really super think about it, but you are coming with that kind of experience. So the Para.Science that you put together 30 years ago, are you guys still doing investigations? What's the kind of work that was built for, and are you still active?
Yes, we're nowhere near as active as we used to be, because we used to be called if someone had a problem haunting, whereas nowadays every other house in the street has got a paranormal investigator. So
Right.
trying to get cases is almost impossible. And then we always like to spend quite a lot of time at a building if we can. I mean, there was one building near me that we spent about 6 years investigating.
Wow.
But nowadays, any building has had so many people visit it that they're reporting hundreds and hundreds of things happening there. There's a building in Chester not far from me, and I know the building intimately because we used to do our piano exams there and piano recital. So I spent years sat there as a child waiting for the white lady and never saw her. But since the television programs have been there and all the amateur groups have been there, they're reporting about 50 different ghosts now. And it's impossible to unpick what was actually there from what people have just made up or misinterpreted. And it's difficult.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
we still do cases, but they do tend to be private cases that we find. The bigger cases are pretty much gone now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, with all the people around. We have a opera house here in my hometown that supposedly has a ghost. And as a teenager, and Ursula Bielski, who's one of the local haunt people, and I'm sure Allison Jorlin too, also because she's like an hour away, have done this before. But we were high schoolers. We were going to put on a small, sort of edited version of our senior play in this, at that point, incredibly dilapidated opera house on our town square. And the three of us who were the seamstresses, the other two were seamstresses. They were teaching me how to sew. We came in with a key you had to go to the cops. So we went to the cops and we got the key and we opened up the place and we went down underneath the stage, and we heard somebody walking across the stage, and we were waiting for some of the boys to show up with some of the the props and things for the play. So we went upstairs to see what was going on, if they'd come, and it was completely quiet. Nothing was going on. I went out into the audience area, and the other two were on either side of the stage. And when we heard them again, and what was interesting was that they went past from one person on the left side of the stage to the right side of the stage where the other person was, and then up the catwalk and across the catwalk. And we could see all the lights were on the stage, and we could see the catwalk, and we could see the circular stair up to the catwalk, and there wasn't anybody there. And the three of us went flying out of the building and went back to get the cop. And he came over, and when we got there, the boys were pulling up in their car with the props, and in we all went. And all the windows were locked, all the doors were locked, there wasn't anything. And I think I was 18, so it was like, this is so great, I'm gonna do this, And then it turned out to be a big chicken and never went. But I'm sure that particular building has been investigated a bunch of times. It's now completely renovated, and they have real events there all the time. And Ursula Bielski and other people around who do ghost hunting have come to give talks and so on. So I'm not sure what the situation is with that building, but at the time there was a rumor in the house. There was a myth in the town, a legend in the town about the building, but nobody was doing that kind of thing. Nobody was going in to see if there was a ghost there, and there were just those kinds of one-off experiences by people who were in there doing something else. We heard stories later on about the women who were the girls who were the prime lady in the play, whatever it was, and usually it was all high schools, and in that time they would always get just missed by a piece of scenery coming down or something, and nobody else would have a problem, so they always attributed that to the to the ghost. And then they had a seat up in the mezzanine that used to go down on its own. So they bolted it down and then put a little plaque on there that had the name of the person they thought threw herself off which I don't think there's any evidence that somebody threw themselves off the parapet of that building either, but it was interesting. That was probably the only kind of ghost experience I ever had in terms of being with people and actually getting really riled up by it and trying to figure out who could have possibly come in there to make that noise, even though we knew, we were hearing and looking at the place where the step footfalls were happening, and there wasn't anything there. So it's I have all these one-offs, and it's just terrible. There's no continuity whatsoever. But I'm so glad that Brian got in touch with you, and I'm very happy that we had this presentation. I think it's really wonderful. I will come back at you after I get it up on YouTube to see if we've got everything that you think we should have in the description as well. I was thinking about including some of the YouTube videos that you were showing the differences between the background noises, so that people can also go off to that while they're coming and going when they're watching the video. So thank you so much, Anne. It's just a terrific presentation, and I know everybody else really was enjoying it. And our friend from Puerto Rico is saying it's just an excellent topic. So I agree with that.
Thank you so much for asking me. It's a
Oh,
great honor.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here, and I'm so glad that you did this. Is really excellent. Well, if nobody else has anything else to say, I think everybody is very happy.
Oh, good.
So I think that's the problem at the moment. Okay, screen 2, screen 1 is what I want. Okay. Alrighty. So it's what's coming up is on the 30th at 3 p.m. Central. We've got Brian Williams doing Seeking Spectral Insight. The closing session for the Paramoog 2023 is at 3 p.m. Central on March 31st. And on the 1st of April, we'll have an open discussion forum. And I am, as I said in the newsletter today, I am definitely inviting everybody, whether you're an attendee or you're somebody who watched things, have watched so far the videos, or you're a speaker, to come back and visit us during the closing session if you can possibly manage it, so that we can all kind of celebrate this event this year. And hopefully we'll have news about not only what we're going to do next year, but also an opportunity to impact that and to let us know what you would like to see us do now that we've rebooted the Paramoog series. So thank you again, Anne. It was really interesting. I'm going to just love editing this. And thank you, everybody who came today, and especially those of you who got up at 6:45 a.m. to come and see this. We're very happy that you were here. So have a great rest of your day, you guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye now. Thanks, Anne.